Maplewood, Oregon, a town where nothing ever seemed to change. The streets were lined with small businesses. The same families had lived there for generations. And the local high school, West Haven, stood as a proud institution with a reputation that had remained untouched for years. But reputations can be deceiving. Beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. Clara Reed, a 15-year-old high school student, had spent her whole life in Maplewood. She had the same routine as every other teenager in town: school, homework, the occasional weekend outing with friends. But there was one thing that set her apart. She had grown up watching her father, Benjamin Reed, fight battles that most people in Maplewood pretended didn't exist. He was a civil rights attorney, one of the few in the state who took on cases that others wouldn't dare touch. He didn't do it for money, because there was little to be made in these kinds of cases. He did it because someone had to. Clara had seen him come home exhausted, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the people who depended on him. Some nights, he would sit at the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of him, silently going over legal briefs with a look of quiet determination. She admired him, even if she didn't fully understand the battles he fought. One evening, he came home later than usual. His face was tight with concern, his briefcase clutched tightly in his grip. He barely spoke during dinner, only nodding when Clara's mother asked about his day. But later that night, as Clara walked past his study, she heard his voice low, serious on the phone. A girl named Isabel Carter had been denied admission to West Haven High. Not because of grades, not because of disciplinary issues, just denied. No explanation. No appeal process. Nothing. Her parents had tried to get answers, but the school district had given them the runaround. A mistake in the paperwork, they said. A clerical error. But something about it didn't sit right. At first, Benjamin thought it was a simple case of bureaucratic negligence. Schools made mistakes all the time. Maybe a misplaced document, maybe an oversight in the admissions process. But as he started digging, he found something unsettling. Isabel wasn't the first. There were other students who had quietly been turned away, all under vague, unverifiable reasons. The deeper he looked, the clearer the pattern became. Clara saw the shift in him. She noticed the way he carried himself, tense, alert, like a man waiting for the next blow to land. She heard the late-night phone calls, the quiet frustration in his voice. And then, one night, she found the case files sitting on the dining room table. Dozens of pages, stacks of documents, notes scribbled in the margins. She scanned the names, the dates, the reasons listed for the rejections. One phrase kept appearing over and over: administrative discretion. A vague, catch-all term that meant nothing, and yet it had kept students like Isabel out of West Haven. Clara didn't fully understand why, but she knew this was bigger than just one girl. Something was wrong, and if her father was right, this wasn't just an accident, it was intentional. And soon, it wouldn't just be his fight. It would be hers, too. Clara had always been fascinated by her father's work. Since she was young, she had spent hours in his home office, watching him sift through stacks of legal documents. His brow furrowed in concentration. While most kids found law boring, Clara was different. She loved the way words could shape reality, how a single case could change lives. That's why she never minded helping him organize his files. It was a routine she had done countless times, sorting paperwork, highlighting key points, placing sticky notes on documents that needed his attention. But one evening, as she flipped through an old case file, something caught her eye. A precedent. It was buried in a folder of dismissed cases, something that, at first glance, seemed unimportant. But as Clara read through it, her pulse quickened. The case involved a student from another district who had been denied enrollment under suspicious circumstances. And in that case, the court had ruled against the school, stating that their so-called admissions discretion violated constitutional rights. She reread it, her mind racing. If that ruling held weight, then Isabel's case wasn't just about one girl, it was about a pattern. A deliberate policy designed to quietly exclude certain students. Her father had mentioned that something felt off about the case. Now, Clara was sure of it. She waited until dinner to bring it up. The table was quiet, aside from the occasional clinking of silverware against plates. Her father looked exhausted, his usual confidence worn down by whatever pressures he had been dealing with that day. Then she spoke. She laid out what she had found, how the case from years ago had similarities to Isabel's situation, how the ruling had set a legal precedent, and how it could be the key to proving that West Haven High was manipulating its admissions process. Her father listened in silence, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed. He explained that he had already suspected as much, but the problem wasn't just proving the school's wrongdoing. It was that he was being blocked at every turn. The school district had powerful allies, and someone, whether it was the Board of Education, the superintendent, or someone higher up, was making sure the case never gained traction. The pressure was mounting. Officials were stalling. Documents were mysteriously going missing. And now, there were whispers, veiled threats, suggesting that if Benjamin didn't drop the case, his legal practice might suffer. Clara could see the frustration in his eyes. He wanted to keep fighting, but he was up against forces far stronger than he had expected. That's when she made her decision. She told him that if he couldn't take the case to trial, she would. Silence. For a moment, Benjamin just stared at her. Then he shook his head, rubbing his temples as if trying to push the absurdity of the idea away. Absolutely not. It was out of the question. Courtrooms weren't high school debate clubs. Lawyers trained for years to argue cases in front of a judge. Clara was brilliant, he had no doubt about that, but this wasn't a game. The stakes were too high. But Clara didn't back down. She argued her case the way she had seen him do 1,000 times before. She pointed out that if the system was trying to silence him, then he needed a voice they wouldn't expect. No one would see her coming. No one would take her seriously until it was too late. She wasn't asking for permission. She was asking for a chance. Benjamin saw the fire in her eyes. The same fire that had once burned in his own when he was younger, before the weight of the system had ground him down. For a long time, he said nothing. Then finally, he exhaled. If she was going to do this, she needed to be prepared. He would train her, guide her, make sure she knew the law inside and out. Because once she stepped into that courtroom, there would be no turning back. And if they were going to take on a system that thrived in the shadows, then Clara Reed had to be ready to bring everything into the light. The courtroom was never meant to be a fair battleground. Clara was about to learn that firsthand. From the moment the case was scheduled, whispers began to spread. This wasn't just about one girl being denied admission anymore. It was about power, who held it, who benefited from it, and what they were willing to do to keep it. And standing in her way were three formidable figures. Judge Gregory Vaughn, the gatekeeper. The first and most immediate obstacle was the man who would preside over the case, Judge Gregory Vaughn. Vaughn was known for his rigid, almost unshakable skepticism. He had spent decades on the bench, building a reputation as a no-nonsense judge who had little patience for what he called frivolous cases. He valued order, tradition, and most importantly, maintaining the status quo. To him, the courtroom was a place for experienced professionals, not a stage for teenage idealism. His mere presence was enough to intimidate most attorneys. For Clara, stepping into his courtroom would be like walking into a lion's den. She would need more than just legal arguments. She would need to prove she belonged there. And Vaughn wasn't going to make that easy. Elliot Graves, the puppet master. Beyond the courtroom, however, lurked a far more dangerous figure. Elliot Graves was a high-ranking official within the state's education system, a man who had spent years carefully cultivating his influence. On the surface, he was a respected administrator, a policymaker, whose job was to ensure fairness in school funding and admissions. In reality, Graves was running a carefully crafted scheme. By manipulating enrollment numbers, schools under his jurisdiction could qualify for additional state and federal funding. Certain students, those who required more resources, had disciplinary records, or simply didn't fit the image of an elite institution, were quietly pushed out of the system, allowing schools to inflate their academic statistics and secure more lucrative grants. It was a business, a dirty, well-oiled machine that turned students into numbers and numbers into profits. And Clara's case was threatening to expose it. Graves wasn't the kind of man who panicked. He was calculated, meticulous. He didn't act impulsively, but when he did act, it was swift and decisive. Clara had no idea he was watching her. Not yet. Lauren Prescott, the legal enforcer. On the battlefield of the courtroom, Clara's most immediate adversary would be Lauren Prescott, the attorney representing the school board. Prescott was sharp, ruthless, and dangerously good at her job. She had spent years defending institutions from lawsuits just like this one, and she knew exactly how to dismantle a case before it ever reached a verdict. For her, the law wasn't about morality, it was about strategy, a game of technicalities, precedents, and loopholes. She had already begun her attack. The moment Clara's involvement in the case became public, Prescott wasted no time filing motions. Motions to dismiss. Motions to delay. Motions to question Clara's legal standing. Every move was designed to exhaust her before she ever got the chance to speak. And if Clara did make it to trial, Prescott would be waiting armed with cross-examinations and legal traps, ready to dismantle her confidence piece by piece. She didn't need to beat Clara in a legal argument. She just needed to make the judge and jury doubt her. And that was something Prescott excelled at. The envelope. A new player enters the game. Clara was prepared to face these adversaries in the open. What she wasn't prepared for was the letter. It arrived without warning. A plain, unmarked envelope slipped through the mail slot of her family's home. No return address. No name. Just a thick stack of documents inside. As she unfolded the pages, her breath caught in her throat. Enrollment records, financial statements, internal emails, proof. It was all there, the irregularities, the falsified numbers, the evidence of schools deliberately pushing students out to boost their statistics. And at the bottom of the stack, a final page, a handwritten note. You're right, but you have no idea how deep this goes. Be careful. Someone wanted her to win. Someone inside the system. But that also meant one thing. If she kept digging, she would be stepping into something much bigger than she ever imagined. And the people at the top, they weren't just going to let her take them down. The courthouse loomed over Clara as she stepped inside, its cold marble walls swallowing her in their enormity. She had spent nights preparing for this moment, going over every argument, every counterpoint, every possible scenario. She told herself she was ready, but preparation meant nothing against what she was about to face. As Clara took her seat at the plaintiff's table, whispers filled the courtroom. Spectators, legal clerks, even other attorneys exchanged knowing glances. A teenager, arguing a case in court. The idea was laughable to them, but no one expressed their doubt more clearly than Judge Gregory Vaughn himself. He leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, scanning the courtroom, as if expecting to see someone else. Then, after a moment of silence, he let out a slow, deliberate sigh. Miss Reed, are you lost? A few quiet chuckles rippled through the room. Clara kept her posture straight, gripping the edges of her notes to keep her hands from trembling. I'm here to present my case, Your Honor. Vaughn exhaled sharply, clearly unimpressed. Your case? He exchanged a glance with Lauren Prescott, the school board's attorney, who smirked in amusement. Yes, Clara said firmly. I am representing Isabel Carter, whose rights have been violated under. Vaughn held up a hand. Miss Reed, I'm going to stop you right there. Are you even legally allowed to represent a client in this court? Prescott seized the opportunity. Your Honor, I would like to formally motion for dismissal on the grounds that the plaintiff's representative is a high school student. More quiet laughter from the back of the room. Clara had expected this. She had studied enough legal proceedings to know that in many cases, a non-lawyer could present arguments if the judge allowed it. She took a breath. Your Honor, the law states that under exceptional circumstances, a non-lawyer may represent a client in court if they receive special permission from the presiding judge. I filed a motion requesting such permission, which was accepted and scheduled for review today. Vaughn raised an eyebrow. He glanced toward the clerk, who quickly sifted through the papers in front of her. After a few seconds, she nodded. She's correct, Your Honor, the clerk confirmed. The murmurs in the courtroom quieted. The laughter faded. For the first time that morning, Vaughn looked at Clara with something other than amusement. Prescott wasn't laughing anymore either. She adjusted her blazer and leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, as she studied Clara like a predator assessing prey. Miss Reed, she said, her voice cool, calculated. You may have found a technical loophole to allow yourself into this courtroom, but do you honestly believe you have the legal knowledge to argue this case? Clara refused to look away. I believe the law is about justice, not about who wears the nicest suit, she responded. A few people in the audience murmured in approval. Even Vaughn's expression flickered with something unreadable annoyance or curiosity. Clara couldn't tell. Prescott, however, remained unimpressed. Very well, she said smoothly. Let's test that knowledge of yours, shall we? She grabbed a stack of documents, flipping through them before pulling out one in particular. Can you explain the legal precedent set by the 1996 case of Albright versus Springfield Unified? Specifically, how it relates to the discretionary powers granted to school admissions boards. Clara knew exactly what Prescott was trying to do. She was throwing obscure cases at her, trying to trip her up, trying to make her falter in front of the judge and the audience. But Clara had done her homework. She met Prescott's gaze and recited, without hesitation, Albright v. Springfield Unified determined that while school boards have discretionary powers, they must adhere to constitutional protections against discrimination. The case reinforced that decisions based on unregulated criteria could be challenged if there was evidence of bias or misconduct, which, she paused, flipping open her own notes, is precisely what we have in the case of Isabel Carter, as evidenced by the irregularities in the admissions process. The room fell silent. For the first time that morning, it wasn't Clara who was being tested. It was Prescott. And she knew it. Judge Vaughn tapped his gavel lightly against the bench, his eyes locked on Clara. Miss Reed, he said slowly, as if still deciding whether to be impressed or irritated. I'll admit, I was expecting a disaster today. Clara held her breath. But it seems you've done your research. She exhaled. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it was something. And as she glanced across the room, at the way Prescott's jaw tightened, at the way Elliot Graves, the high-ranking official overseeing the education system, sat motionless in the gallery, it was clear. She had their attention now. And they were starting to realize this wasn't going to be as easy as they thought. The deeper Clara dug, the more unsettling the truth became. What started as a single case of unfair rejection was quickly unraveling into something much bigger. And she wasn't the only one who noticed. Nathan Brooks, an investigative journalist, had been quietly following the case from the sidelines. He was known for exposing corruption in local government, and something about this lawsuit had caught his attention. One evening, Clara found herself sitting across from him in a dimly lit diner, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee. You're onto something big, Nathan said, sliding a thick folder across the table. And you're not the only one who wants answers. She hesitated before opening it. Inside were pages of enrollment data, internal memos, even emails between school officials, documents that shouldn't have been public. The more she read, the more her stomach twisted. Schools across the district had been manipulating their admissions numbers for years. On paper, everything looked legal. But in reality, certain students like Isabel, had been systematically filtered out based on unspoken criteria. Race, income, special needs, anything that made them inconvenient for the system. It wasn't just West Haven. It was everywhere. This isn't just about one school, Clara murmured. They've built an entire system to keep certain students out, while inflating their success rates. Nathan nodded. And it all leads back to Elliot Graves. Elliot Graves, the powerful education official who had been overseeing these policies for years. He was respected, feared even, and had deep connections in both politics and finance. If he was involved, this wasn't just an administrative issue. It was corruption at the highest level. But they needed more than just suspicious documents. They needed a witness. And that's when Harvey Dunn came forward. Harvey had worked in the education system for nearly 3 decades before quietly resigning. He had seen things he was no longer willing to stay silent about. When Clara met him, he looked exhausted, as if years of guilt had worn him down. He barely touched his coffee, his fingers trembling as he spoke. "I used to believe in what we were doing," he admitted. "But then I saw how they rigged the numbers. Graves ordered us to tweak enrollment data so we could qualify for federal funding. The more elite we looked on paper, the more money we got. And students like Isabel, they never stood a chance." Clara felt her pulse quicken. This was it. The missing piece. Harvey agreed to testify. But before he could, the threat started. Clara found the letter tucked under the windshield wiper of her father's car late one night. There was no signature, no return address, just a single sheet of paper with a chilling message. "Walk away. Or you won't like what happens next." Her hands clenched the letter as she reread the words. Fear prickled at the edges of her mind. She knew what this meant. Someone, maybe Graves, maybe someone even higher up, was watching her, trying to scare her, trying to stop her. But instead of backing down, Clara did the only thing she could do. She folded the letter, tucked it into her case file, and got back to work. The courtroom was tense. The kind of tension that made the air feel heavier. The kind that made every movement, every breath, seem amplified. Clara sat beside Olivia Barrett, the Justice Department attorney, who had taken a keen interest in the case. Barrett was sharp, methodical, and unshaken, the kind of lawyer who could dismantle a defense with nothing more than cold, hard facts. And today, that was exactly what they planned to do. Lauren Prescott, the school board's attorney, started strong. She painted the lawsuit as a simple misunderstanding, a bureaucratic mishap that had been blown out of proportion. She was smooth, confident, until Clara and Barrett unveiled what they had. The room fell silent as Barrett placed a thick stack of documents on the table. "These are internal records from multiple school districts," she began. "They show a pattern: students like Isabel Carter systematically denied entry under vague, shifting policies. Meanwhile, funding allocations soared under the leadership of Elliot Graves." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, these records were never meant to be seen by the public. They were hidden because they expose a deliberate effort to manipulate enrollment numbers for financial gain." Across the room, Elliot Graves sat stiffly. His expression remained composed, but Clara caught the faintest flicker of unease in his eyes. Then came the moment that changed everything. Harvey Dunn took the stand. The former administrator looked nervous, his hands gripping the edges of the witness stand. But when he spoke, his voice was clear. "I was instructed to adjust enrollment data," he admitted. "Certain applicants were flagged. We were told that rejecting them would help maintain the school's excellence rating. And in return, we'd qualify for more funding." Lauren Prescott objected, claimed that Dunn was a disgruntled former employee looking for revenge. But then, Clara made her move. She stood, steadying herself before speaking. "You claim Mr. Dunn is lying," she said. "But we have something that proves he's not." She reached into her case file, pulling out an email printout. "Your Honor, this is an internal email from Elliot Graves to school officials. In it, he specifically states that adjusting enrollment procedures is necessary to keep the district financially competitive." She turned to Graves. "Do you deny sending this?" Graves leaned forward, jaw tightening. "That's a misinterpretation of my words." But it was too late. The damage was done. Judge Vaughn, who had been skeptical from the beginning, leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin as he reread the document. For the first time since the trial began, he looked truly uncertain. Clara could see the shift in his demeanor. He wasn't dismissing her anymore. He was considering the possibility that she was right. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as Judge Vaughn leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Clara. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in the room. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that came before a decision that could change everything. Clara felt her pulse pounding in her ears, her hands gripping the edges of the podium so tightly that her knuckles turned white. For weeks, she had fought against seasoned lawyers, powerful officials, and a system that had been designed to keep people like Isabel Carter out. She had faced ridicule, skepticism, and even threats. Yet, she had stood her ground, refusing to be silenced. Now, everything came down to this. Judge Vaughn cleared his throat and finally spoke. "This court finds that the West Haven School District engaged in discriminatory enrollment practices, violating both state and federal regulations. Effective immediately, the district is required to reform its admissions policies to ensure transparency, fairness, and equal opportunity for all students." A stunned silence followed. It was as if no one had fully processed what had just been said. Then, a murmur, a gasp. The realization spread like wildfire through the room. Clara had won. Benjamin Reed let out a slow, measured breath beside her, as if he had been holding it in for the entirety of the trial. His lips curled into a proud smile, though his eyes held something deeper: admiration, relief, and maybe even a hint of disbelief. Olivia Barrett, the government attorney who had stood by Clara's side, gave her a subtle nod of respect. Across the courtroom, the expressions were vastly different. Lauren Prescott stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line as she rapidly flipped through her notes, as if somewhere in the pages she could find a way to undo what had just happened. Elliot Graves sat frozen, his usual smug composure shattered. His career, his carefully built empire of manipulation, was crumbling right in front of him. Clara turned and caught sight of Isabel Carter, seated in the back row. The girl's eyes shimmered with tears, but this time they weren't tears of frustration or defeat. They were tears of hope. As Clara stepped out of the courtroom, the world outside was waiting. Cameras flashed. Reporters swarmed. The courthouse steps had turned into a battleground of questions. How does it feel to make history? Did you ever expect to win against such powerful opposition? What's next for you, Clara? For a moment, she was overwhelmed. But then she took a breath, letting the noise settle around her. She had fought too hard, sacrificed too much, to let this moment pass without saying what needed to be said. She stepped forward to the microphone. "I didn't do this alone," she began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "This case was never just about me. It was about Isabel Carter and every other student who has been unfairly denied an education because of a system designed to exclude rather than include. But more than that, it was about something bigger. It was about accountability, about reminding those in power that their actions have consequences, and about proving that the truth doesn't care about age, status, or influence. It only cares about justice." The crowd erupted in applause, a mixture of cheers and murmurs of agreement. In the sea of faces, Clara spotted Nathan Brooks, the investigative journalist who had helped expose the corruption at the heart of the case. He gave her a small, approving nod before disappearing into the crowd, likely already preparing his next explosive article. As the excitement continued, Clara felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see her father standing beside her, the proudest expression she had ever seen on his face. That night, back at home, Clara and Benjamin sat in their small, cluttered living room. The house was quiet, except for the occasional hum of a passing car outside. The weight of the past few weeks was finally lifting, but the exhaustion was undeniable. Benjamin leaned back on the couch, rubbing his temples. "You know," he mused, "I spent years fighting cases like this, always trying to push for change. But today you taught me something." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? And what's that?" He turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "That sometimes it takes fresh eyes to see what others miss. And that maybe, just maybe, the world needs more voices like yours in the courtroom." She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "I don't know, Dad. I think one legal mind in the family is enough trouble." He chuckled, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet certainty. "Maybe. But whether you end up in a courtroom again or not, one thing's for sure. You've already made a difference." Clara looked out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. A week ago, she had doubted herself. She had questioned whether she even had a chance against the giants she was up against. Now, she knew better. She wasn't just the girl who won a case. She was the girl who changed everything.